The first rays of sunlight slipped over the pine-covered mountains, casting a golden glow across Silver Creek National Park. A thin layer of morning mist drifted above the winding river, making the forest feel almost untouched by time. Ranger Daniel Harper adjusted the collar of his green uniform before climbing into his aging pickup truck. For the past 11 years, this park had been his second home. He knew every trail, every rocky ridge, and nearly every ancient tree by heart. Beside him, his canine partner Max was already waiting. The 6-year-old German Shepherd leaped effortlessly into the passenger seat, his intelligent amber eyes scanning the forest even before the engine started. Ready for another quiet day, Daniel smiled. Max answered with a soft wag of his tail. Their morning patrol followed its usual route through the eastern section of the park, checking, hiking, trails, fire, lookout stations, and wildlife monitoring cameras. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Birds sang from the treetops. A family of deer crossed the dirt road ahead. Nothing suggested that this day would be different from any other, until they reached the Redstone River. Without warning, Max stood upright. His ears shot forward. Every muscle in his body became tense. Before Daniel could react, Max jumped from the moving truck the moment it slowed near the riverbank. Daniel hurried after him. The German Shepherd sprinted toward the water, but suddenly stopped at the edge of a flat rock overlooking the river. He didn't bark. He didn't sniff frantically. He simply stared. His eyes remained locked on the slow-moving current, as though something invisible was drifting beneath the surface. Daniel stepped beside him. "What are you looking at?" The river was crystal clear. Smooth stones rested beneath the shallow water. Sunlight danced across the ripples. There were no boats, no fishermen, no wildlife, struggling in the current. Nothing. Daniel waited almost a full minute. Finally, Max calmly turned around and walked back toward the truck. The strange moment was over as quickly as it had begun. Daniel chuckled. "You've officially become the world's first fish inspector." He scratched Max behind the ears before continuing the patrol. The following morning, the exact same thing happened. As soon as they approached the river, Max rushed to the identical rock. Again he stood perfectly still. Again he stared into the water. Again he left without making a sound. Daniel frowned. This wasn't random. Max had been trained to detect missing people, explosives, and even subtle human scents carried by the wind. He never repeated meaningless behavior. Something had caught his attention. But what? On the third morning, Daniel arrived 15 minutes earlier than usual. Max still led him to the exact same place. Nothing had changed. The river flowed peacefully. The forest remained silent. Daniel searched both riverbanks through binoculars. No footprints. No abandoned campsite. No damaged vegetation. He even checked the motion cameras installed nearby. Hours later, the footage revealed nothing unusual. No people had entered the area overnight. By the fourth day, curiosity had replaced confusion. Daniel began recording everything in his Ranger notebook. Day 408:12 a.m. Max stopped at the river. No barking. No digging. No visible target. Duration 58 seconds. The fifth day brought identical results. The sixth day was no different. The timing was astonishing. Every morning, Max reached the river at almost exactly 8:12 a.m., never varying by more than a few seconds. It was as if he was waiting for something that only happened at that precise moment. Daniel couldn't explain it. On the seventh morning, heavy gray clouds rolled across the mountains. A cold wind swept through the valley, bending the tall grass along the shoreline. As soon as the truck stopped, Max jumped out again. This time, however, he didn't climb onto the familiar rock. Instead, he walked nearly 100 feet downstream before stopping beneath an enormous willow tree whose branches stretched low over the water. His body became rigid, his eyes focused on the opposite bank. Daniel slowly followed his gaze. Dense forest. Thick undergrowth. Nothing else. Then Max let out a low growl. Not an aggressive bark. Not a warning. It was the quiet, controlled growl Daniel had heard only during dangerous search and rescue operations. Something was there. Something Max could sense. But Daniel could not. Daniel quickly raised his binoculars. The forest remained still. Then, a shadow flashed between two pine trees. Just for a fraction of a second, too fast to identify. Daniel adjusted the focus. Nothing. Only branches swaying in the wind. He lowered the binoculars, wondering whether his eyes had deceived him. Max hadn't moved. His gaze remained fixed on the exact same location. Seconds later, the German shepherd turned toward Daniel. He gently grabbed the bottom of Daniel's pant leg, not pulling hard, just enough to get his attention. Then Max looked back toward the river. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a warning. It was a message. Follow me. Daniel didn't hesitate. The moment Max released his pant leg, the ranger followed the German shepherd along the riverbank. The thick undergrowth slowed them, and fallen branches cracked beneath their boots, but Max never looked back. His pace remained steady, his nose lifted slightly into the wind, instead of tracking the ground. That alone puzzled Daniel. Max usually followed scent trails with incredible precision, yet today he seemed to be following something carried through the air. When they reached a narrow bend in the river, Max suddenly froze. Across the water, hidden between towering pine trees, stood a man. He wore a dark, waterproof jacket and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his face. The distance made it impossible to recognize his features, but one thing immediately stood out. He wasn't hiking, he wasn't fishing. He was watching them. Daniel instinctively raised his binoculars. Before the lenses came into focus, the stranger stepped backward behind a tree. Seconds later, he was gone. Daniel crossed the shallow section of the river as quickly as possible, expecting to find fresh footprints. Instead, he found almost nothing. The damp soil showed only a few partial boot prints before disappearing onto solid rock. Whoever the man was, he knew exactly how to avoid leaving a trail. Max circled the area silently. Then he stopped beside an old cedar stump. He sniffed once, twice. Finally, he looked directly at Daniel. The expression in the dog's eyes was unmistakable. The scent was familiar, not familiar to Daniel, to Max. That realization sent a chill down Daniel's spine. Back at the ranger station, Daniel reviewed every security camera covering the eastern entrance to the park. Hours passed. Vehicles came and went. Families arrived for hiking. Cyclists entered the trails. Birds crossed the cameras. But the mysterious man never appeared. It was as if he had entered the forest without using a single official road. Daniel enlarged one frame showing the distant riverbank. A tiny dark silhouette stood between the trees. The image quality was terrible. Still, something caught his attention. The stranger seemed to be carrying a long metal case over one shoulder. It wasn't camping equipment. It looked expensive. Professional. That evening, Daniel filed a brief incident report but left out most of his suspicions. One blurry figure wasn't enough to justify launching a full investigation. After sunset, heavy rain rolled into the valley. Lightning flashed beyond the mountains while thunder echoed through the forest. Around midnight, Max suddenly lifted his head. A deep growl rumbled through the cabin. Daniel grabbed his flashlight. What is it? Max was already standing beside the front door. Another growl. Longer this time. Daniel switched off the interior lights and quietly looked through the window. Nothing. Only rain. Only darkness. Then, a faint beam of white light moved between the trees. Someone was walking outside. The flashlight disappeared behind the equipment shed. Daniel opened the gun safe, removed his service pistol, and stepped onto the porch. Park ranger, identify yourself. Silence. The rain swallowed his voice. Max sprinted toward the shed. Daniel followed. When they rounded the corner, nobody was there. Only muddy footprints leading toward the vehicle garage. The garage door stood half open. Daniel was certain he had locked it before going to bed. Inside, nothing appeared stolen. The rescue equipment remained untouched. Fuel cans were still lined against the wall. The radios hadn't moved. But something was missing. Daniel searched every shelf again before realizing exactly what had disappeared. The large topographic survey map of the entire Redstone River Valley was gone. Max stood motionless near the empty wall hook. where the map had been hanging. His ears remained forward, his eyes fixed on the open doorway. Someone hadn't broken into the ranger station to steal equipment. Someone wanted the river. And somehow, Max had known it all along. Daniel locked the station before sunrise and packed only what he absolutely needed. He carried a flashlight, climbing rope, first aid kit, handheld radio, waterproof notebook, and the remaining survey maps stored in the archive room. Whatever had happened during the night was no longer a simple trespassing incident. Someone had entered a secured ranger station, ignored expensive equipment, and stolen a single map focused on the Redstone River Valley. That decision could not have been random. Max waited beside the truck without making a sound. The German Shepherd seemed calmer than the previous evening, yet his eyes never stopped scanning the forest surrounding the station. Daniel noticed the change immediately. Max behaved this way only when he believed danger was nearby but hidden. They reached the river shortly after 8 o'clock. Once again, Max ignored the familiar rock and walked directly toward the enormous willow tree. This time, he continued farther downstream until the river narrowed between two walls of dark stone. The current rushed faster here, producing a constant roar that drowned every other sound. Daniel carefully studied the opposite bank. Nothing moved. No birds landed nearby. Even the usual squirrels seemed absent. The silence felt unnatural. Max suddenly climbed onto a large boulder and stared toward a cluster of moss-covered rocks almost hidden beneath hanging vines. Daniel followed his line of sight and finally noticed something strange. One section of the cliff looked perfectly straight. Nature rarely created edges like that. Curious, Daniel crossed the shallow water and pushed aside the vines. Behind them stood a rusted steel door. Its surface was almost completely covered by moss, making it nearly invisible, unless someone knew exactly where to look. "There you are," Daniel whispered. The heavy door refused to move. Years of moisture had sealed it shut. Daniel examined the frame more closely and froze. Fresh scratches marked the old locking mechanism. Someone had tried opening it recently. He photographed every detail before testing the handle again. Nothing. Max sniffed around the entrance before stopping near a crack beneath the door. He inhaled deeply, then backed away and looked toward Daniel. The scent inside was fresh, very fresh. Daniel removed a compact inspection camera from his backpack and carefully slid the flexible lens through the narrow opening. The tiny screen flickered. At first he saw only darkness. Then the image adjusted. A concrete corridor stretched into the hillside. Dust covered the floor. Old electrical cables hung from the ceiling. Rusted pipes lined one wall. Most surprising of all, a single electric lantern sat on the ground only 20 yards inside the passage. It had not been there for decades. Someone had placed it recently. Daniel zoomed closer. The battery indicator on the lantern glowed green. It was fully charged. A cold wave traveled down his spine. Someone had been inside this hidden structure very recently. Before he could continue exploring, Max growled sharply. Daniel spun around. Across the river between the pine trees, the same dark figure stood watching them again. This time, the stranger did not run immediately. Instead, he slowly lifted one hand. Not to wave, not to threaten. He simply pointed toward the steel door. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest without making a sound. Daniel rushed across the river, but the man had vanished once more. Only one clue remained. Pressed into the soft mud beside a fallen log lay a small silver badge. It was old, scratched, and stained with dirt. On the front, beneath the faded emblem of a government research agency, two words were still clearly visible: authorized access. Daniel slipped the weathered badge into an evidence bag before taking one last look at the empty forest. Whoever the stranger was, he had disappeared without leaving another trace. The only proof that anyone had been there was the badge lying in the mud and the fresh scratches on the steel door. Back at the ranger station, Daniel photographed every angle of the badge and sent the images through the park's internal database. No match. He widened the search to state records. Still nothing. The agency logo no longer existed. It had been dissolved decades earlier. Only a short archived document remained. Department of Geological Research. Closed in 1984. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Why would a forgotten research agency build a hidden underground facility beneath a remote river? Before he could continue reading, Max walked to the office window. The German Shepherd stared toward the parking lot. His ears slowly lifted. A white pickup truck rolled into the station. A man wearing a clean gray business suit stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as Victor Lawson, claiming to represent a private environmental consulting company working with the state. "I heard someone discovered an old research structure near Redstone River," he said politely. Daniel frowned. "I haven't filed a public report," Victor smiled. "News travels quickly." The answer felt rehearsed. He continued asking questions. How large was the entrance? Had Daniel managed to get inside? Did he recover any documents? Daniel deliberately gave vague answers. Victor nodded, politely, thanked him, and walked back to his truck. But instead of driving toward the park exit, he stopped at the end of the road. For nearly 5 minutes he remained inside the vehicle without moving. Max never took his eyes off the truck. Only after Victor finally disappeared did the German Shepherd relax. That afternoon, Daniel decided to return alone to the hidden entrance. This time, he brought a portable hydraulic spreader from the rescue garage. The rusted steel door resisted at first. Then, with a loud metallic crack, the locking bar snapped. The heavy door opened only a few inches before decades of dust poured into the daylight. Cold air drifted from the darkness below. It smelled dry. Not abandoned, dry. As though fresh air had recently circulated through the tunnel. Daniel switched on his flashlight. Max stepped inside first. Every movement became cautious. The concrete corridor stretched deep beneath the hillside before ending at another reinforced door. Old warning signs still clung to the walls. Authorized personnel only. Level B, access required. Electric cables disappeared into the ceiling. Most had deteriorated, one had not. A newer black cable ran along the floor before disappearing beneath the second door. Daniel knelt beside it. Someone had installed it recently. His heartbeat quickened. The underground facility wasn't simply an abandoned relic. Parts of it were still being used. Suddenly, the beam from his flashlight reflected off something metallic. A surveillance camera. Small, modern, mounted high in the corner. It was aimed directly at the entrance corridor. Someone had been watching every person who entered. Daniel immediately turned off his flashlight. The corridor fell into darkness. For several seconds, neither he nor Max moved. Then a faint mechanical sound echoed from somewhere deeper underground. A door, opening slowly. Max's body stiffened. His ears flattened. A low growl filled the silent tunnel. Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight. Footsteps. Someone was walking toward them. Not running. Walking. Slow. Confident. And getting closer with every second. Daniel instinctively pulled Max behind a thick concrete support as the footsteps echoed through the underground corridor. The sound was steady and deliberate, as though the person approaching had no fear of intruders. Daniel switched off his flashlight completely, allowing only a faint beam of daylight from the entrance to illuminate the tunnel. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. Daniel held his breath. Max remained perfectly still beside him, every muscle tense but under control. Unlike ordinary dogs, he never barked unless absolutely necessary. His discipline had saved lives more than once. A soft click broke the silence. Then, another. Someone was unlocking the reinforced door farther inside the tunnel. A narrow strip of white light appeared beneath the metal frame before the heavy door slowly opened inward. Daniel carefully peeked around the pillar. A single man stepped into the corridor wearing a dark work uniform, protective gloves, and a helmet with a mounted flashlight. He carried a black equipment case and walked directly toward the entrance without looking around. He wasn't armed. He didn't seem nervous. Instead, he looked like someone performing a routine inspection. Just before reaching the exit, the man suddenly stopped. His flashlight swept across the floor. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Fresh, muddy footprints. Their footprints. The worker slowly crouched, studying the marks with obvious concern. He touched one print with his fingers, then immediately reached for a handheld radio clipped to his belt. "Control," he whispered. "We've had visitors." Daniel didn't wait another second. He silently motioned for Max to retreat. The German shepherd backed away without making the slightest sound. Together, they slipped outside just before the man reached the tunnel entrance. Hidden behind dense bushes, Daniel watched as the worker emerged into daylight and examined the surrounding area. Within minutes, another surprise arrived. A black helicopter appeared above the valley. It circled once before landing in a clearing nearly half a mile away. 3 more people climbed out. None wore government uniforms. Instead, they were dressed in identical gray tactical clothing without names or insignias. Daniel photographed everything using the zoom lens on his camera. The helicopter carried no visible company logo, no registration number, nothing. The newcomers disappeared into the hidden tunnel with the first worker. What kind of research station needs anonymous security? Daniel murmured. Back at the ranger station, he compared the photographs with every federal agency he could access. Nothing matched. That evening, he received an unexpected phone call. Daniel Harper speaking. This is Professor Amelia Rhodes from the State University. Daniel frowned. I don't believe we've met. We haven't, she replied. But someone forwarded me the photographs you uploaded this morning. You know that facility. A long pause followed. Finally, Amelia answered quietly. I spent 2 years searching for it. Daniel's expression hardened. Then you'd better start explaining. She lowered her voice. Not over the phone. They agreed to meet the following morning at a small riverside cafe outside the national park. Before hanging up, Amelia added one final sentence. If that underground station is active again, leave immediately. Daniel looked toward Max. The German shepherd had been lying peacefully near the office door. Now he was standing. His eyes were fixed on the window. Daniel slowly turned. A dark SUV was parked across the road. Its engine was running. The windows were completely black. As Daniel watched, the driver's side mirror tilted downward. Not by accident. It was aimed directly at the ranger station. Someone inside was watching him. And this time, they weren't trying to hide it. Daniel refused to leave. He stood behind the office window watching the black SUV parked across the road. Its engine continued to idle quietly, yet no one stepped outside. After nearly 5 minutes, the vehicle pulled away without warning and disappeared into the forest. Max remained alert long after it was gone. The next morning, Daniel drove nearly 40 miles to a quiet cafe overlooking Lake Harrison. At exactly 9 o'clock, a woman in her early 40s entered carrying a weathered canvas satchel. I'm Professor Amelia Rhodes, she said. Daniel nodded. You recognize those photographs immediately. Amelia sat down before answering. Because I've been looking for that underground station for almost 12 years. She removed an old black and white photograph from her satchel. It showed the same steel entrance hidden beneath vines. Standing beside it were 6 scientists wearing uniforms bearing the same faded government emblem Daniel had found on the silver badge. My father was one of them. Daniel studied the photograph carefully. What happened? No one knows. Amelia sighed. In 1984, the government announced that the research project had been canceled after severe flood damage. The station was officially abandoned, and every scientist involved supposedly accepted transfers to other facilities. But you don't believe that. She shook her head. My father never came home. Daniel looked up. He disappeared. Not officially. Amelia reached into her satchel again and placed a sealed envelope on the table. I received this 3 days after his last phone call. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. Don't let them reopen the chamber. No signature, no explanation. Daniel felt a chill. What chamber? That's exactly what I've been trying to discover. Amelia opened a laptop and displayed several satellite images of the Redstone Valley taken over the past 20 years. At first, they looked identical. Then she highlighted one small section near the river. Every few years, the vegetation above the hidden station changed in a perfect circular pattern. Trees grew faster, grass became greener. Even during droughts. It isn't natural, Amelia said quietly. Something underground is still generating heat. Daniel leaned closer. Geothermal, that's what I believed. She opened another document. It isn't geothermal. The report described an experimental underground energy system developed during the early 1980s. Unlike traditional power plants, it produced electricity using powerful underground water pressure moving through specially engineered tunnels beneath the mountain. The prototype had never been announced publicly. If successful, it could have powered entire towns without burning fuel. So why hide it? Daniel asked. Amelia looked toward the cafe window before lowering her voice. Because someone wanted to sell the technology. Before Daniel could respond, Max suddenly stood, his ears lifted, his eyes fixed on a man sitting alone near the entrance. The man wore sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. A newspaper covered most of his face, but his phone camera remained pointed directly toward their table. Amelia noticed him too. "Don't look again," she whispered. "He's been here since before I arrived." Daniel calmly closed the laptop. "We're leaving." They exited through the rear door and hurried toward Daniel's truck. Just as they reached the parking lot, Max stopped abruptly. The German Shepherd stared beneath the driver's side door. Daniel followed his gaze. Attached underneath the truck was a small black tracking device with a blinking green light. Someone hadn't simply been following them. They had expected Daniel to leave the park, and they wanted to know exactly where he would go next. Daniel crouched beside the truck, carefully sliding beneath the driver's side. The small black tracking device blinked every few seconds. It had been attached with an industrial-strength magnet and looked far more sophisticated than anything sold to the public. Amelia knelt beside him. "Can you remove it?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." She looked confused. "If we take it off now, whoever planted it will know we've found it." Instead, Daniel reached into his backpack and wrapped the tracker in a layer of aluminum emergency foil before placing it inside a metal thermos. The signal would weaken, making it appear as though they were simply driving through poor reception. "We'll let them think they're still following us." Amelia smiled. "I like the way you think." The three climbed into the truck, with Max sitting silently in the back seat. Rather than returning directly to the park, Daniel drove south toward an abandoned logging road that had been closed for nearly 20 years. After several miles, he turned into a deserted maintenance garage hidden among towering pines. Inside, an old park utility vehicle still sat beneath a faded canvas cover. Daniel parked the truck, left the tracker hidden inside the thermos beneath the driver's seat, and transferred their equipment into the utility vehicle. If they're watching the signal, he said, they'll spend hours following an empty truck. They left through a narrow service trail known only to veteran rangers. By late afternoon, they reached the Redstone River again. Max immediately took the lead. Instead of returning to the hidden steel door, he followed the shoreline farther upstream than ever before. His pace was quick, almost urgent. After nearly half an hour, the German Shepherd stopped beside a massive granite outcrop rising directly from the riverbank. He sniffed the stone, then barked once. It was the first bark he had given since this strange investigation began. Daniel examined the cliff. Nothing, just weathered granite covered with moss. Amelia, however, noticed something unusual. Listen. A faint humming sound echoed from inside the rock. Daniel placed one hand against the surface. She was right. The vibration was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Electricity. Somewhere behind the cliff. Searching more carefully, they discovered a narrow crack hidden beneath hanging ivy. Cold air drifted steadily from the opening. "It's connected," Amelia whispered. "The underground station." The passage was barely wide enough for one person. Daniel entered first, with Max directly behind him. The tunnel sloped downward for nearly 200 feet before opening into an enormous underground cavern. All three stopped in disbelief. Below them stretched a gigantic chamber unlike anything they had imagined. Steel platforms surrounded a vast underground reservoir where crystal-clear water flowed through enormous turbines. Most of the machinery was old. Some had rusted beyond repair. Yet, several sections had clearly been restored using modern equipment. Fresh cables crossed the floor. New control panels glowed with blue indicator lights. The facility wasn't abandoned. Someone had brought it back to life. Amelia stared at the turbines. "My father wasn't building a laboratory." Daniel nodded slowly. "He was building a power station." Before either of them could move closer, voices echoed through the chamber. Several workers wearing gray uniforms entered from another corridor. Daniel quickly pulled Amelia behind a row of inactive generators while Max lay silently beside them. One worker carried a tablet displaying digital construction plans. Another pointed toward the turbines. "We're ahead of schedule," he said. "The investors will arrive in 3 days." Another worker laughed. "They still think they're buying mining rights." Daniel exchanged a glance with Amelia. Mining rights? What did that have to do with a hidden hydroelectric facility? The answer came only seconds later. The supervisor unfolded a large blueprint across a steel table. Even from a distance, Daniel recognized the map. It was the same Redstone Valley survey map stolen from the ranger station. Except this version contained something new. A thick red line circled nearly the entire river system. Across the top of the blueprint in bold black letters were 4 words that made Daniel's blood run cold. Phase 1. Control the water. Daniel remained perfectly still behind the inactive generator. From where he crouched, he could clearly see the blueprint spread across the steel table. The thick red circle covered almost the entire Redstone River watershed, stretching far beyond the national park. The words, Phase 1, Control the water, echoed in his mind. One of the engineers tapped the map with a metal pointer. "If we complete the diversion tunnels," he said, "every gallon flowing through the valley can be redirected." Another man frowned. "What about the surrounding towns?" The supervisor shrugged. "They'll receive exactly what we decide to release." A ripple of unease spread through the room, but no one argued. Daniel exchanged a glance with Amelia. This wasn't about producing clean energy. Someone intended to control the region's entire water supply. Max's ears twitched. The German shepherd quietly shifted his attention toward another corridor branching from the enormous chamber. A faint metallic clank echoed through the darkness. Someone else was approaching. Daniel carefully peeked around the generator. A tall man wearing a charcoal gray suit entered the chamber accompanied by 2 armed security guards. He wasn't dressed like an engineer. The workers immediately stopped talking. "Status report," the newcomer demanded. "The turbines are operating at 68% capacity," the supervisor replied. "And the secondary gate, we're still trying to unlock it." The suited man frowned. "It must be opened before the investors arrive," Amelia whispered, almost silently. "Secondary gate," Daniel nodded but kept watching. The supervisor pointed toward a sealed concrete wall on the opposite side of the chamber. Behind it stood an enormous circular steel door nearly 30 feet high. Unlike the rest of the abandoned facility, this door looked untouched by time. Its polished locking mechanism reflected the overhead lights. Someone had been maintaining it for years. "What exactly is behind that door?" one engineer asked. The suited man answered without hesitation. "The original reservoir." The room fell silent. He continued. "When the project was abandoned, the government sealed the lower chamber because it contained the main pressure system. If we reopen it," another worker said cautiously, "the entire hydroelectric network becomes operational." The suited man smiled. "Exactly." Daniel finally understood. The underground station wasn't valuable because of hidden minerals or forgotten research. It was an engineering masterpiece capable of controlling the natural flow of water across hundreds of square miles. In the wrong hands, entire communities could lose access to clean water. Suddenly, Max let out the faintest growl. One of the security guards stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" The second guard turned toward the generators. "I thought it was machinery." Max froze instantly. His discipline was remarkable. The guards listened for several seconds before continuing their patrol. Daniel slowly released the breath he had been holding. That had been too close. A few moments later, the suited man removed a small electronic device from his pocket. It resembled a modern access key. He walked toward the massive circular door and pressed it against a scanner beside the frame. A soft electronic chime echoed through the chamber. Nothing happened. A red warning light flashed. "Access denied." The supervisor looked nervous. "The system still requires another authorization." The suited man slammed his fist against the wall. "Find it. I don't care whether it's a key, a code, or a person. Without that authorization, this entire project is worthless." Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Somewhere, another access credential still existed. Perhaps the mysterious scientist Amelia's father had hidden it before disappearing. Perhaps that was why he had written, "Don't let them reopen the chamber." The meeting finally ended. One by one, the engineers left through the eastern corridor. The suited man and his guards followed. Within minutes, the enormous underground chamber became quiet again. Daniel waited another 5 minutes before standing. "We have to find that authorization first," Amelia whispered. Daniel nodded. "But where do we start?" Before anyone could answer, Max walked confidently toward the giant steel door. Instead of sniffing the scanner, he sat directly in front of the concrete wall beside it. Then he scratched once at the floor. Only once. Daniel aimed his flashlight downward. Beneath decades of dust, a narrow brass plate was embedded into the concrete. Someone had tried very carefully to hide it. Daniel knelt beside the brass plate, while Max remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the massive circular door. Amelia brushed away decades of dust with a soft paintbrush from her backpack. As more of the metal surface appeared, a carefully engraved inscription became visible. "Emergency Manual Override. Authorized personnel only." "There has to be a mechanism nearby," Daniel whispered. They searched the surrounding wall inch by inch. After several minutes, Amelia discovered a shallow groove hidden beneath a layer of cracked concrete. She inserted the blade of her multi-tool and gently pried it open. A narrow compartment slid outward. Inside rested a small brass cylinder no larger than a fountain pen. Daniel carefully lifted it. "This can't be the authorization," he said. Amelia examined its unusual design. "It isn't a key. It looks like a data cartridge." The brass cylinder carried the same government emblem Daniel had seen on the silver badge. One end contained a row of tiny metal contacts unlike any modern connector. Before they could inspect it further, Max suddenly stood. His ears pointed toward the eastern corridor. Footsteps. Several people were returning. Daniel quickly slipped the cylinder into his pocket. The three hurried behind a massive, inactive turbine, only seconds before voices echoed through the chamber. The suited executive had returned. This time, he wasn't alone. 6 armed security contractors entered behind him carrying tactical rifles and portable scanning equipment. The leader addressed the engineers. "We've searched every archive. The final authorization isn't in any government database." One technician hesitated. "What if it was destroyed?" The executive shook his head. "It wasn't destroyed. It was removed." He pointed directly toward the sealed chamber. "The chief engineer disappeared before the project was shut down. We believe he took the authorization with him." Amelia's face turned pale. "My father." Daniel slowly nodded. Everything was beginning to fit together. Her father hadn't vanished by accident. He had hidden the final authorization to keep the underground system from falling into the wrong hands. Meanwhile, one of the security contractors activated a handheld scanner. "We've got movement." Daniel's heart stopped. The guard slowly turned toward their hiding place. The scanner beeped again. Closer. Another step. Another beep. Max lowered his body, completely silent. The contractor stopped beside the turbine. He looked around carefully before aiming the scanner toward the floor. Daniel noticed a blinking indicator on the screen. The brass cylinder. It contained an electronic signal. The guard smiled. "I found it." Without waiting another second, Daniel grabbed a loose metal wrench from the floor and threw it across the chamber. The heavy tool crashed loudly against an old generator. Every head turned. What was that? 2 guards sprinted toward the noise. In the confusion, Daniel motioned for Amelia and Max to move. They slipped behind another row of machinery, staying just ahead of the searching guards. The distraction lasted only seconds. "Split up," the executive shouted. "They're still here." Flashlights swept across the enormous chamber. Max led Daniel toward a maintenance staircase, climbing to an upper service tunnel overlooking the turbines. They reached the narrow passage just as 2 guards entered below. From the elevated walkway, Daniel could see almost the entire underground complex. Then something unexpected caught his attention. The massive circular door wasn't the only sealed entrance. Far below the main platform, partly hidden beneath rushing water, another smaller steel hatch stood open. Fresh boot prints covered the concrete leading inside. Someone had already entered the lower level. The executive wasn't searching for the authorization to unlock the chamber. He already had another way in. He simply wanted complete control before anyone else discovered what was hidden beneath the reservoir. As Daniel stared into the darkness beyond the lower hatch, a powerful vibration shook the entire underground station. Dust fell from the ceiling. Warning lights suddenly flashed red across every control panel. A computerized voice echoed through the chamber. Pressure internet. Emergency flood sequence initiated. Red warning lights pulsed across the underground station as sirens echoed through the cavern. Emergency flood sequence initiated. The mechanical voice repeated the warning every few seconds. Daniel looked toward the lower reservoir. Water was already rushing through massive concrete channels that had remained dry for decades. "We have to get out," Amelia shouted. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. If the system flooded while the executive's team remained inside, they would simply escape and return another day. Worse, the underground facility could collapse, destroying every piece of evidence hidden within it. Max barked once and sprinted toward the control platform. Daniel followed. The main control room overlooked the entire hydroelectric station. Most computer screens were dark, but one emergency console had automatically powered on. Across the room, the suited executive was already there. He pointed a pistol at Daniel. "Hand me the authorization cylinder." Daniel remained calm. "You've spent years looking for it. And you'll never have it." The executive smiled. "I don't need it anymore." He pressed a button on a handheld remote. Several explosive charges mounted along the support columns began flashing red. Amelia gasped. "He's going to destroy the station." "If no one can control it," the executive replied coldly, "no one will ever know it existed." Before he could trigger the detonator, Max launched forward. The German Shepherd slammed into the man's chest with incredible force. The remote flew across the floor. Daniel tackled the executive while Amelia kicked the pistol out of reach. The two men struggled violently. The executive reached for a metal wrench lying beside the console. Before he could swing it, Max seized his forearm, forcing him to release the weapon. Daniel quickly pinned him to the floor and secured his wrists with heavy-duty restraint ties from his rescue kit. Outside the control room, security contractors rushed toward the noise, but they stopped when they saw flashing emergency lights throughout the station. One engineer shouted, "The floodgates are opening." Panic spread instantly. The contractors abandoned the fight and ran for the exits. Amelia hurried to the emergency console. "The pressure keeps rising." "Can you stop it?" Daniel asked. She examined the outdated controls. "Not without the authorization." Daniel removed the brass cylinder from his pocket. "This one," she nodded. "It isn't just an access key. It completes the operating system." She carefully inserted the cylinder into a concealed slot beneath the console. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then every monitor flickered to life. Old engineering diagrams filled the screens. A message appeared. "Chief Engineer authorization confirmed. Manual control restored." Amelia immediately canceled the emergency flood sequence. One by one, the warning lights disappeared. The turbines slowed. The water level stabilized. Silence slowly returned to the underground chamber. Hours later, state police, federal investigators, and emergency response teams arrived after receiving Daniel's distress signal. The hidden hydroelectric station was secured. Investigators recovered construction plans, financial records, surveillance equipment, and communication logs, proving that the executive's organization had secretly planned to seize control of the valley's water system through private ownership disguised as an environmental development project. Amelia finally learned the truth about her father. He had never abandoned his research. He had sacrificed everything to hide the final authorization, ensuring no one could misuse the station after his disappearance. Weeks later, the government officially declared the underground facility a protected historical engineering site. Its technology would be preserved, studied, and never placed under private control. On a quiet autumn morning, Daniel returned to the Redstone River with Max. The river flowed peacefully beneath the willow tree where the mystery had first begun. Daniel knelt beside his loyal partner. "You knew something was wrong before any of us." Max looked toward the water. His tail wagged gently. For 7 days he had returned to the same river. not because he understood the engineering hidden beneath it, but because he trusted the instinct that had never failed him. Daniel smiled as sunlight shimmered across the flowing current. Some secrets were buried beneath stone. Others survived because one loyal dog refused to walk away. And because Daniel chose to follow